I want to start off by really giving a big shout out to the organizers of this event and giving us new speakers to get started on. I thank everybody of you who has joined this session, because I know there's other amazing sessions going on at the same time. So thank you so much for choosing this one. And today I'm actually really excited to get to share with you my love of real-life puzzles and especially how to solve them. So in other words, the ultimate jigsaw, architecting Azure Synapse Analytics. As you all might remember, Azure Synapse Analytics came out last year in the fall with quite a lot of noise. It was this next big new thing that would solve all our data project problems and just be the solution to all our data problems in the world and be the go-to tool in the future. And we saw amazing demos where we could see just data coming alive in a few seconds. And I got so excited, I just dashed to the Azure portal and went looking for Synapse. And it was there, except when I actually put it up, what happened was that I ended up with what we just a few days called Azure Data Warehouse. So we've come quite ways from there, and the service is now in preview for us to all find in the Azure portal. And it's the time when a lot of customers are looking into it and getting started. So it's really the perfect time to get on top of things. And now, as you do head into the Azure portal, you do find Azure Synapse Analytics, but you find some options to choose from. But this first step might be easy to just navigate through and think, okay, maybe it's the preview one, the workspaces. Private link just doesn't know right at this point, and we don't want the data warehouse. So you might get started and get your Azure Synapse Analytics started. Once you get the service up, you start looking around, and there's many things there. There's SQL, there's ADLS, there's virtual networks, and so on. Like how do I figure out how this all works together, and what do I do with it? So that is my goal for today. And so we will start by going through the different components of Azure Synapse Analytics and how they fit together, and how they also will come in handy for you in your data projects. Then we will look at securing Azure Synapse Analytics mainly from the perspective of access control this time, because security is a big topic. So I just wanted to bring up the one topic that comes up first when it started. And then we will end the session with really looking through how do you actually use Azure Synapse Analytics? How do you take those components that we've just gone through and the security things that we've covered, and how do you make that come to life? So I am Heini Ilmarinen. I work for Atea Finland as a solutions architect. And since I'm Finnish, I guess this whole online conference thing should be just fine for me, and not seeing anybody's faces and just getting to keep my distance. But, you know, it would be nice to do questions. Luckily, I have Alexander and Andy there. But if you at any time feel like you just want to pop something in the chat or anything like that, that would be really fun. So just feel
Heini,
free to do that. Yes.
Before you continue, unfortunately, our audio is still having some periodic breakup issues. We can pretty much hear what you're saying, but there is, some audio issues. So at this point, may I suggest that you turn off your video to try and save some bandwidth, please?
Yes. Let me just check my connection here.
Because it comes and goes, and of course, everything was fine right until we began.
Of course, that's the usual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there shouldn't be anything extra going on here.
And of course, it's fine now.
Yes, of course.
Of course. Okay, maybe I just have to talk slower or something. So let's try that.
Otherwise, if it starts happening again, I'll have you cut your video feed to try and save some bandwidth.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Very good.
So if you feel like reacting anything at any point, just shout out in the chat or anything like that. Just make a little noise. I am also a Microsoft certified trainer. And as you might notice along my session here, I'm really passionate about architecture and infrastructure, especially when it comes to the data domain. And from my previous life, I was studying math and was a math teacher. And so there's a little math nerd inside of me, still hiding. So if anyone ever wants to talk math, you can come to me. And also, you might notice I do a little bit of doodling on the side as we go along here. So let us get to the actual presentation from here. So we're going to start with the components of Azure Synapse Analytics.
Heini, before you get into it, I am going to ask you to cut your audio because it still seems that audio is volatile and it is coming in and out depending for different attendees. So,
all right.
Just cut your video.
Let's do that then. Let me see. Where are my controls? Way too high.
All right.
Okay.
Let's give it a shot.
Perfect. At least I have a picture there with a smiling face, so you have something to look at. So let's give it a go this way then. So let's start with the components of Azure Synapse Analytics. As you know, Synapse Analytics is still in preview, but that actually means it's the perfect time for you to really dig deep into the service and see what the different components and pieces are and figure out how they fit together. Because even if things are going to change, at least you have some kind of starting point and reference point to go on when those changes do come in. So it's really the time to get to the bottom of how everything works together. And the challenge with Azure Synapse Analytics is that there are a lot of components to it. As you get the service up, you find things like pipelines, you find the pools like the HashSpark and the SQL Pool. You find things to do more with the management, like private endpoints. And even when you dig deeper, you just find more and more terminology and components and things to manage on the way. So how do you really get to grips with everything? How do these fit together and what do you do with each of these? I want to take a step back and really look at kind of the standard data project, what are the steps that we go through as we move through those. And then we can kind of pull in the components of Azure Synapse Analytics and how they fit into this story. So if we look at like an average data project, there's often some data sources that we're handling, and we want to bring data in from those data sources. Then most likely we don't just want to use that data as it is, but we want to do something to that data. Most likely we need to do some preparation, maybe some data cleanup and validation that the data quality is good. But then we might also want to do some transformations and enriching and combining the data with other data sources as well. And then finally, we do get to the stage where we get the data to a state where it's ready to serve. And finally, for example, visualize or to be used by another app or something like that. And all the meanwhile, we need somewhere to store our data during all the processing on the way. So if we look at what this would have looked at previously on Azure, it meant that we had to take different services from Azure and put them together. Take Azure Data Factory, Azure SQL, Azure Data Warehouse, maybe Azure Databricks, Power BI, and there was no way to have like a unified management or anything like that for all those services. And we would have to take and knit all those services together to make all these steps happen for us. But now with Azure Synapse Analytics, what we're told is that this will solve everything. It will kind of cover the whole set of the steps that are needed in our data project, from the ingestion of data to all the transformations and all the way even linking it with Power BI for visualization. But the thing is, there's still many different parts to the process. And even though we have one main service, it does not mean that you are actually working with just kind of one type of task or one kind of component through all of this. But actually, we still have many of those components that we knew previously, and they've just been brought under the same service. But when we do put up an Azure Synapse Analytics, we get a few things that are and span through all of these steps in this data project. So let's start with those. Because when we put up an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, what we get is the Azure Synapse Studio, which is the user interface that we can use to really work with all of these steps and all of the components and tools that we have within Azure Synapse Analytics. We also get the monitoring through the workspace. So we have the monitoring for all of the pieces in one place as well. And lastly, we get the management. In some cases, also security is put in the same place. But from my perspective, it's not entirely true because we do have to handle it in a few different places. So if we now take a step in and start to really zone into Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, what do we find from within it? We can kind of categorize it in three main layers. We have the data layer, then we have the orchestration, and then we have different options for the analytic engines as well. And remember that all those three are wrapped inside the three that I showed in the previous slide. So they're managed and monitored from a unified place for which the user interface is the Azure Synapse Studio. So if we start from the very bottom, when we put Azure Synapse Analytics, we need an Azure Data Lake storage. To be more exact, it's not that the Azure Data Lake storage is part of Azure Synapse Analytics, but you cannot put Azure Synapse Analytics workspace up without it. So it's like a prerequisite that we need. But if you were to delete your Azure Synapse Analytics, you would still keep your data lake. So it's not exactly within Azure Synapse Analytics, but it's really tightly coupled, and it is needed and it is used for many things in the Synapse Analytics. If we then take a step up and go to the orchestration layer, oops, there we go, we get the pipelines. So this is essentially the same thing as we know as Azure Data Factory. And just within the Synapse documentation, it's most often called pipelines. So that's why I used that word in here. But if you look at especially how it's managed and how you build pipelines and so on, it is really the same thing as Azure Data Factory. And the thing is, there can be some little differences because Azure Synapse Analytics is in preview, whereas Data Factory is in general, like it is generally available for all of us. So the orchestration layer is really one of the main core components for Azure Synapse Analytics because it will help us orchestrate any of the tasks that we need to do within our data projects. And we'll get more to details with that. And the whole pipeline section and the Azure Data Factory is really a big topic, and we could be talking about just that part for many hours, actually. And the thing is that today we won't have time for that, but just know that there's things behind there to learn if you're really into that kind of data movement and how to make everything or timed and so on. Then we get to the top layer, which is the Analytic Engines. And here we get the most kind of options. When we put our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace up, we end up with an SQL on demand in the very beginning. That's the only thing we have right out of the box without doing any configuration once we've started with the service. So this is kind of actually the setup that you have in the beginning. You have your Azure Data Lake, you have the pipelines functionality, and you have SQL on demand. And you're actually ready to get started at that point, really. You can already start with those components. But there are more things that you can also bring in. So the SQL on demand is exactly what it says on the tin. So it is for you to use when you need it for like ad hoc queries and so on in an SQL, in the TSQL language. So the nice thing about that is that you can straight pop that together with the data lake storage and actually already query that raw like CSV files and Parquet and so on straight with the SQL on demand without having to move it to any kind of relational database. But we do have some other options for the analytic engines as well. And on the other SQL side, you have the SQL Pool, which then is the provisioned version of the SQL in the Synapse Analytics. And this is what we used to know as Azure Data Warehouse. So if you've been working with Azure Data Warehouse already, this is where you can take all the knowledge in and just use it within Azure Synapse Analytics, just as it is. And the fact is that it is provisioned capacity, so you have to determine how much capacity you need and so on. So there's, of course, a cost to that. But you can also stop and start that capacity as needed as well. So it's a very different kind of way to manage it compared to the on-demand, because that just, you get the resources whenever you need those. And as the third piece, we have the Spark, we have the Apache Spark Pool as well. And this is also provisioned capacity. And this is really what allows you to spin up a pool, an Apache Spark cluster for you to use for many different languages, and for example, go more into the machine learning things and so on in your data project. So just to sum up the analytic engines, we have two flavors of SQL, the provisioned one, the SQL Pool, and then the on-demand SQL. And then on the Apache Spark side, we have the provisioned version Apache Spark Pool. So now we kind of have the main components that are within Azure Synapse Analytics. And we really want to take a look at how do they fit into that data project and those steps within a data project. So let's see how that fits in. The data layer really kind of falls down to the storage layer in the first picture that I showed. And just as I said, it's kind of a matter of preference whether you want to draw that as part of the Azure Synapse Analytics. Technically, it's its own resource, and you just connect to it very closely with Azure Synapse Analytics. Then we have the Orchestrate Layer, which actually, if you think about it, that is what we use for all parts of our data project. We use it in the ingestion part just for like simple copy activities from a data source. But we then also can use those pipelines to orchestrate whatever transformation and preparation steps we have to get it to the serve stage, kind of the data that is all nice and formed in the way that we want it for our end purpose. And then our analytics engines then fall into the preparation, transformation, and serve stages mostly. So we will choose from the three flavors that we have and use the one that best suits our needs. And of course, what can affect that is, for example, just what tools are people used to working with? That's a very good reason to choose one or another. But then also, like, is it just ad hoc queries, or is it something that is done regularly? And then on the other hand, what kind of like do we have to be, how do we need to store the data as we've done the transformations as well? And since we did have the visualization box in there, I wanted to bring in that, yes, then we have the option of integrating with Power BI really nicely as well. So here we have the bits and pieces of Azure Synapse Analytics, not all the nitty-gritty details, but now you kind of know how the main parts fit together and what they are for. So in the next step, then, we can go into the phase of how do we secure Azure Synapse Analytics. And I'm gonna, as I said, I'm gonna focus on access control because that is what you're gonna run into in the very first phase. And the easy thing is that if you're just setting up an environment for yourself, things mostly run really smoothly because you are the owner of everything. You have really like owner rights in Azure, and then as you set up the environment, you get all the needed rights as you go along. But as you're setting up Azure Synapse Analytics, on the very first page, you get this big blue box that tells you, like, if you want to add other people, there's all these things that you need to consider. So it's actually already kind of pointing to you that there's more you should know about this topic, because there's many parts to it as well. And the parts that we have are mainly two main parts, because we have the Azure Airbag access control, and then we have roles within the Azure Synapse Workspace as well. So let's start with the Azure Airbag roles. So if you worked with Azure, you're most likely very familiar with the main roles in Azure. But if you have not worked with it before, I'll just give a really swift recap of what they are. So the three main roles are owner, contributor, and reader. And the owner role can do everything: create resources, modify resources, plus add other user access rights as well. So that's the person who can give rights to other people as well. The second credential is a contributor, and that can do everything that the owner except give rights to other people as well. And lastly, we have the reader role, and that just means that you can see the resources that have been created in the scope that you have credentials for. So what does that mean from the perspective of Azure Synapse Analytics? Well, it means that if you have owner or contributor rights, you can create an Azure Synapse Analytics and you can change the configuration to that. And also, you can spin up the different kind of analytic engine pools that we have in the service as well and change the configuration to those as well. But on the other hand, these rights do not necessarily mean that you have access to the Azure Synapse Workspace, which I actually, just before this session today, managed to somehow remove my rights into the actual workspace. And even though I had owner rights, I had no way of getting in, which was kind of interesting in the quite last few moments. But at least now I know that that is possible. So to recap, the point here is to know that with the Azure Airbag roles, you are able to manage really the resources and kind of the externals of the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. You can't really do anything within the workspace, like development or so on, without additional rights. But that kind of allows you to manage the Azure side of things. And then the other part of the equation is then the Azure Synapse Workspace roles. And within Azure Synapse, we have actually three main roles as well. And it kind of reflects the different components and parts of Azure Synapse Analytics as well, right there. So we have Workspace Admins, SQL Admins, and Admins. And if we start with the top one, that is the most access that you get. With the Workspace Admin, you can do things within the Azure Synapse Analytics. And that's the main difference compared to Azure Airbag. You can do things within the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And that means you can create pipelines and the entire orchestration side. And also the Workspace admin can do development on both the SQL and Spark cluster pools. But then if we move to the SQL admin, on the other hand, that means that yes, they can kind of get access to the workspace and they can do certain things there, but the main focus is development on the SQL side. And on the other hand, if we have Spark admins, then that means development on the Spark side. So just as we had the different components within Azure Synapse Analytics, these workspace roles really reflect that same pattern as well. We have the Workspace admin, SQL admin, and the Spark admin. And now we're actually going to get to the fun stuff here, to how to actually use Azure Synapse Analytics. We now have a really overview of the different components of Azure Synapse Analytics and how those components fit together. We have a little understanding of where they also fit in the different stages of a data project. We also got some knowledge about access, and I will bring now in the examples a bit of networking in as well, but I want to keep that in the light side. But the main question now is how do we actually use all of these, and how do we choose the pieces that we use? For me, this question, how do we actually use these pieces? It always starts with understanding where are we, what's the context? And that's really what I love from what I do, getting to understand where we're working with and what the situation is. And from there, we can choose the most kind of fitting pieces for our purposes. So I'm going to give you a small example here. We have a small company where we have a small team of data professionals who all kind of are kind of doing all trades in the data field. So they're doing some SQL and some data prep and so on. They kind of do a little bit of everything because it's a small team. So there's not really so much possibility for specialization or anyone doing specific things. But also this team has just a few data sources in the beginning. And these data sources come from some software as a service applications and some open data sets. And what this team is going to do, they want to just start to explore that data and try to find some predictive models from that data and bring them out to their custom app that they want to bring to the customers. So now we really want to get to thinking like, how would we set up Azure Synapse Analytics for this team and for their goal? So if we start from the previous picture, we had the steps of the data model. We know that when they set up Azure Synapse Analytics, they have to have an Azure Data Lake store, and they're going to get the orchestration side. And since they're going to need to move some data around, the orchestration part is really important for them. But on the other side also, they're going to need some tools to do some exploration on their data as well. And for their purposes, it could be that in preparation phase or the exploration phase, you can just use the SQL on demand to just check out their data really easily, see what's there, just check if it's clean, if some prep needs to be done for it. But then if they're, for example, more accustomed to using Spark as a tool, they could be using that as their main tool for preparation and transformation of the data. And especially if they're looking at going into making machine learning models and so on, Spark has more functionality for that than just SQL on-demand pool. As you can see, I have not actually put in the SQL Pool, the provisioned version here, because it's not necessary that they actually need it in the first phase. They might not actually have that much data that would then make sense to have that functionality for them. And they could actually just serve their data then once it has been prepared and transformed, they could just pass it on to their SQL on demand and have some views there, and then have the data pulled from there for their applications. And if you really think of this, this is what a lot of proof of concepts look like in Azure Synapse Analytics. They start kind of small and start with the main pieces that you need to get started. And right away from the get-go, you start with the SQL on demand and the pipelines and data lake storage. And you can actually do things with that already. So you don't necessarily need so many things in addition to that. And it can be a really good place to start. But the fact is that not even all teams will need all the functionalities of Azure Synapse Analytics, even in the long run. But there's always the possibility to then expand those needs and add components to the mix later on. So then we could have the custom app, as I said, reach directly from the SQL on demand. And instead of visualization, we have the consume part there. But this is just one example, and not all use cases are going to look the same, and not all use cases are going to be like this one that I just stated. So then what about if we have a different kind of situation? For example, a lot of the customers that I work with, they might have a little bit of a bigger team. They have some people working more on the database, the relational database side, and some working more on kind of getting started on machine learning and experimenting and so on. So we can actually have different teams. So straight from the start, that means we have quite different requirements for access control, for example. Also, a lot of the times, there can be many different sources in the mix. Now I am wondering if I got dropped. Andy, are you still there?
Yeah, Heini, your audio is kind of cutting in and out once again.
Damn it.
But I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Let's hope it continues that way.
Right.
I lost kind of you guys on the side there.
Just
shut
all
down our
disable the video.
as a just in case.
Ah, cool. Okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. I just got confused whether I was still online or not. So, as we were saying, in a lot of the cases, there can be many data sources, and more importantly, those might be in internal networks. So that, again, brings different kinds of requirements to the entire environment, and especially to the security. And for example, in this case, the main focus for them is the reporting and just getting started with machine learning and experimenting with machine learning. In this case, it would much more mean that they would go for all the bits and pieces of Azure Synapse Analytics. And that would mean, of course, in the beginning, having the data lake storage linked up to everything, then having the pipelines for orchestration, and then having not just the SQL on demand, but also the SQL pools and the Spark pools for different purposes. And the thing is that you might actually even have different teams that work on the different tools in Azure Synapse Analytics. And also, if you're really looking into going the machine learning way, you can also directly integrate Azure Synapse Analytics with the Azure machine learning side as well. And of course, the Power BI ties in with everything really easily. right in the same Azure Synapse Studio as everything else as well. So now we're actually gonna take a look at a demo, and I'm gonna show some of these things that we have been talking through here in practice, and kind of showing the differences also what there might be on the networking side, because I just thought that will be easier to see than to explain on the slides. So let me switch over to my other screen here and get that a little bigger here. So could somebody give me a shout that the size is okay and you're seeing the Azure portal and so on?
Everything looks good.
Perfect, thank you. So I have actually 2 Synapse environments here set up, just because I wanted to show some differences on the networking side in practice here. So I have my Synapse Workspace ready here, and I'm going to start from here because that is what you start with as you get starting with the service. And this is what you end up with. And as I was saying, there's many things here, and you kind of need to know where to start. And it's not so obvious where you can get started with bringing in your actual data. But the main tool to use is the Synapse Studio. So if we just open that up, so we can get to the right place. Let's actually, I'm gonna show this one because here I have some things on the way. And as we come to the dashboard, we can already see that we have some kind of tips here where to get started. But I want to kind of point you to the left side where we have the main navigations. As I was saying, we get the monitoring and management in the one place throughout all our data steps. But then here we also have the orchestration, the development, and data. And that is kind of where we need to get started. But before we kind of look at this side, I want to show from the Azure portal side kind of the different analytics engines. So as we were talking, in the beginning, when we put this up, we actually only have this first version here, SQL on demand. But then we can put up more SQL pools, and actually we can link more than one of those pools. So I could have more than just this one that I have here. But also we can have the other side, the Apache Spark pools, where we provide our own size of cluster that we want to have, whether we want that to be auto scale and so on as well. So this is kind of where we find all those bits and pieces that we went through in the beginning. But then this Azure Synapse Studio is kind of where we can see everything. And what you might notice is that you can see all the same things here as well. You can find the same pools that we saw in the Azure portal here in the Synapse Studio as well. And as we were talking about access control, this is also where we find the different access control credentials as well. So if I were to want to add somebody else into the workspace, not really give them access to the Azure portal so much, I could just decide that I want to give somebody SQL admin rights, and then let's see if I can find my other account here and just add that other user just as an SQL admin. And that would mean the Synapse Studio would look a little bit different for them than it does for me. As we also kind of only skim through the orchestration section, you can see there's quite some things related to that side, but if you want to find out more about that, just dig into some data factory documentation and blogs and things like that that you can find, and to get really on board of that, because the orchestration side and the external connections really come from the Azure Data Factory world. But as the purpose for us to really know these bits and pieces was to know what those pieces are and how to use them. But the purpose for that is that we can actually do something with our data. We don't want to know that just for the fun of it, even though it might be a little fun, but we actually want to know it so that we can actually do something with our data. And here on my screen, let's see, get that out of the way. You can see that I have some data in my workspace. And in the linked side, you can see the data lake storage that I actually linked with this workspace. So if I click into that and start looking at what data I have here, I have a bit of a sample data set that can be found online, and I can provide the details of where to find that. And it's just CSV files. And if I just want to take a look at what kind of data that is, I can just go in and create a new SQL script and just do a little exploration and see what's actually there. And as you see, I have the SQL on command here, and that means it's going to take a little while for it, once I run this, that it'll get the capacity for it to use. It might be that it was such a short time that I had last used it that it not have given up the resources yet. But if there was a long pause, it could take a little longer on the first query to get the results, but then it kind of, once you have the resources, then it goes quite quickly. And now it's just easy for me to see, okay, there's some dates here, there's some times as well, and then even the contents of the Twitter data as well. So I can kind of really easily just check what is there and not have to do a whole lot of moving of the data out of the data lake before I can just check, like, what does the data look like? So it's much easier to get started with that. So this is the Azure Data Lake storage that I have linked to my Azure Synapse workspace. But also in this workspace, I have a database. This is actually a sample database from Azure and Microsoft that any of you can get for yourself to get started. And it's the same thing. We can see the different items that are there, and we can start digging deep into, like, what kind of format is it and so on. And it's also that we can, for this, we can just check out how is the data formatted and what's there and what is from the data that we actually want to use. And that might take a little time for it to load. Yes. Okay, that's on its way. And for this one, as you can see, it's pointing to the Get Started SQL, which is the Sql Pool. So this is not the on-demand version, but this is the actual provisioned SQL, or the old Azure Data Warehouse that we're using here. So you could see that we could use the SQL both for the querying the Azure Data Lake, but also we can have data in the actual SQL pool as well. So really the how to do the querying and across what data sources, that has become so much easier. So I also want to show you a bit of my other environment, because that has a little bit of a different setup. because I wanted to talk to you about the networking side as well. So because on this side, this is just kind of out of the box environment that I would put up just for a proof of concept, not really taking so much care about the networking. But sometimes when you work, especially with bigger enterprises, they have requirements about that. How can the data be accessed? From where can you even query the data and so on? So there is a way for you to have a virtual network for your workspace. And that way you can also configure all the different pools that you have. These are the on-demand SQL and then the SQL warehouse. You can configure them to have endpoints in that virtual network that is assigned to the Azure data warehouse. The one thing about this at this point is it's called the Managed Virtual Network for Azure Synapse, is that you cannot really have any control over that virtual network, and that is kind of part of the deal as well. It's meant so that you cannot actually accidentally mess up the network as you add some new private endpoints. They are configured automatically and everything will be fine. But if you need a connection to your own networks on premises or anything like that, at the moment with the managed virtual network, that's not quite possible. And also, if you've set up the managed virtual network, you cannot remove it at a later point. So you're either stuck one way or the other. So that is why I had one environment set up with a virtual network and one without. So you can see here, there's no managed private endpoints, but the access goes through Azure just using the default endpoints that the SQL, for example, has. So we have seen all the different bits and pieces of Synapse, and we have seen how we can find them from the actual Synapse Studio as well, and how we can get started with just playing around with the data and exploring and so on. And we could even start with orchestration and move to other parts of this as well. But unfortunately, today we do not have time to go more into that part. But the point is that now, as you have access to these different parts and you know what each part does, you know which components of Azure Synapse to choose for yourself as well. So let us get out from here. So we started the session with going through the components of Azure Synapse Analytics, which we also looked how they fit into a basic data project and kind of the main steps of a data project. We then also looked at securing Azure Synapse Analytics from the viewpoint of access management today. And especially when we get bigger groups into using Azure Synapse Analytics, if it's just me, I don't really have to worry about it because everything comes out of the box. But if there's more people and teams involved, the more careful we have to be with the access management. And lastly, we looked at some examples of how to actually use Azure Synapse Analytics, which components you would choose, and in which parts of the process you would use them, and then how in some cases you would actually go with the whole package. So as you now know all these components, and you know even how to secure your Azure Synapse Analytics, and you know how to choose the best parts for your use case, now you're ready to go into the Azure portal and get started with your Azure Workspace and put up that workspace and get playing with your data and really see your magic happen with your data and really bring your data to life and see it happen right in front of your eyes. Because Azure Synapse can really bring together all the parts of the data process, from just ingesting the data to transforming the data and then serving the data and finally even visualizing it. So I hope you all got excited and just want to jump on it right away and just go ahead and get trying. There's excellent get started materials just in regard of data sets, and I can provide the links to those afterwards. So I really hope you all enjoyed it, and please get started with Azure Synapse and go do some magic with your data. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I was going to say, you do have a couple of questions in the Q&A panel. So do you want to address those now?
Yes, that's what I was hoping for.
Yes. Do you want me to read them off to you, or do you just want to read them off yourself?
Let me see. I need to stop sharing, that way I can check them myself. There we go. Okay. Okay, there's a lot of text here. Yeah. Okay. Did you happen to, Andy, have those questions kind of set to
Sure.
the
I was just going to read them, or typically we'll just go through them in the order that they came in. So first of all, so what contains SQL on demand that created automatically?
What contains? Was that the question?
I'm just reading it word for word. So
Okay.
I'm guessing English must be a second language. So just trying to figure
Yep.
that out. Yeah.
So when you do create the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace and you get the SQL on demand when you put that up, so you get both the compute engine of actually running the TSQL queries, either against your data lake or even a database. But actually, you can also create a database on your SQL on demand, and then create views and external tables and things like that. And that way you can actually even connect directly to that SQL on demand from Power BI, for example. So you not only get that kind of it's not just compute for you to use there, but you can actually even create a database there with views and things like that, that then reference data sources elsewhere, like the data sources in your data lake.
All right, excellent. Next question, can the compute used for SQL on demand be scaled? Or does Synapse manage that, and do we have visibility into that?
Yes, it gets scaled by Azure Synapse Analytics, and there's not much we can see about it. We can see whether it's available and whether it's running. And if we do that exploration in the studio and just kind of are running the queries on the go, we can see when the query actually starts or whether it's gathering the resources or what it's doing. But there's not so much that we can do about like idle time or anything like that at this point, but I'm sure there will be more coming as we go along.
All right. What is typically the overhead or lag when you submit a query for it to provision a compute?
So if we're talking about the Spark pools, for that side, so the Spark pool has an idle time that you set for it. So it can be, for example, after you're submitted a previous query, it'll stay up for 15 minutes and then it'll go down. And if it has gone down, then it can take a few minutes for that Spark cluster to be spun up again the next time you're submitting a query. So because it's provisioned, it'll take time for it to come up and then it'll run the query. Then on the SQL pool side, because that's provisioned as well, as long as you don't have that paused or something like that, that capacity will be there for you to use at any moment. So when you just submit the request, it'll go through. Of course, if there's a lot of queries going in, then that's another factor and can create some queue time. But just if you say you just have just one query going in.
All right, awesome. One more question from this person. Can the SQL on demand queries be throttled or resource limited to prevent runaway queries?
At this moment, no. So yeah, you just put a query in and you hope for the best and you see what comes out. And just don't make runaway queries, which is easier said than done, unfortunately. But yes, no, not at this point, no.
Okay.
So the SQL on demand is you have less control, but it's pretty much there for you to use at any time you want. And it's kind of easy to get to if you don't want to manage so much infrastructure or anything like that. It's kind of the easy go-to compute for that.
Excellent. So next question, when will I choose to use Sql Pool versus when will I choose Spark?
This is a good question. In a way, you can do most things with both. And depending in what person who you ask, they will give you different answers. If you get a full heavy Spark user, they will probably say like Spark is the answer to everything and you can use it at any time. But let's be honest, if you haven't used Spark before, it's kind of intimidating. You really have to go into the coding and there's different languages that you can use. So you need to know which language to use, what's the syntax and so on. So you need to know exactly what you're doing.
I can see Simon Whiteley shaking his head right now.
But of course, if you're used to using it, it's really powerful and you have more flexibility as well. Exactly. So it's more a case of what do you want to use and what are you comfortable with. But even if you're not comfortable with the Spark side, I would encourage everybody to just give it a try and just play around with it. It's actually really fun to see what you can do with the data on that side as well.
Excellent. So another question, when would I look at Synapse versus a solution comprising of Data Factory or Databricks, etc., separately?
So at this point, Synapse is still in preview. So if you need really strict SLAs and so on, I wouldn't go to Synapse at this point. But if it's not so exact and you kind of want to be on the edge of the new thing, I would definitely then veer towards Synapse, because at this moment, it seems that it will contain all those different components within it. But being in preview, it does mean it might change and we don't know exactly what it will be once it becomes generally available. So there is always that kind of little, we're not sure where it's going. But what it looks like to me is that you will be able to use the parts that you need of Azure Synapse Analytics. So if you don't need the data warehouse side, then you can just not use it. But you still have the option to just plug it in. So that gives you really great flexibility. Whereas if you had that same solution comprising of many parts, and then you wanted to add the data warehouse, it would be much more work to just get all the connections up and running and so on. So if it keeps heading the way it's going, and there's still this possibility of just using the bits and pieces, I would just go with Azure Synapse. That's my personal kind of opinion at this point. But of course, we don't even know what the end pricing will be or anything like that. So I know at least here in Finland, where we're kind of looking after the money quite carefully in a lot of the companies, that will also be a factor.
Right on. Okay, last question for now. How do I connect to Power BI?
So you, in the Synapse Studio, there's right on the home screen, there's a visualize button where you can click, and then it just asks you to connect to your Power BI workspace. So it's quite straightforward, and you can just, as you navigate to the studio, find the visualize button, and then it will start asking the information about your Power BI workspace that you want to link with your Synapse. Yeah.
All right, and that looks to be it for the questions. So great job.